everyone, welcome to Tech Talk. Today we are going to learn about OOPS concept in Python. So if you already aware about OOPS concept in some other language like Java or some other language, so that would be easier for you. But if you don't know about anything, about OOPS concept, don't worry, just bear with us. We are here to help you with that. So without any further ado, let's get started. So what is OOPS? OOPS is the abbreviation of object-oriented programming. So in Python, object-oriented programming allows us as developers to write the code in a slightly different way, than we would write if we didn't have object-oriented programming in Python. The purpose of object-oriented programming is to make our life as developers simpler by allowing us to write code that looks like more of a real world objects or things like chairs or tables or printers or things like that. So, using these real world objects and real world things in your programming would be more interactive and more easier to work with. So this is the main purpose of OOPS concept or object-oriented programming in Python. So before going further on object-oriented programming, let's have a look on this program that I've written here. This is, I think you already know that this is a very generic way to, code that we have learned till now. So here you can see that I have created one dictionary called student, which has a key called name and it has a value as Rolf, and another key is grade and it has value as one tuple which has values like 10, 20, 30. And here I have created one function of calculating average. And this average function is taking sequence as its input and it is returning the sum of the sequence divided by length of the sequence, which is the average of the sequence that you will give. So here I want to calculate the average of the grade that Rolf has. So what I have to pass here, when I am calling this average function, I have passed the student dictionary's grade key values, which has 10, 20, 30. And if I run this program here, and you will see that 20 is returned, which is the average of 10, 20, and 30, right? This is a very generic way of doing programming. But what we can see here, if you notice very carefully, that this average function has no relation, has no direct relation, rather I say, with this student dictionary. Why so? Because as we have called this function here average and giving this input student grade as sequence, and passing the student grade as the argument when calling this average function. But it must not be the student's grade always. You can pass any sequence over here when you are calling this average function. So this average function doesn't know anything about your student, which what is the student's name, what is the grades. This average function doesn't know anything. It is just simply taking the sequence what you want to calculate the grade of average of, and just calculating the average and returning it to the user. So for us developers, like it is the coding style will be nicer when we create a object, we create the programming or the code in an object oriented programming way, so that this function can directly relate it to this student object. In object-oriented programming, the student will not be considered as any dictionary or anything else. It will be considered as an object, so that we can directly relate to this student to this average function, so that we can directly say that, hey student, what is your average grade? And that function will directly return the students, particularly that student's average grade. So ideally what I'm asking to do, like if we could do like that, print student dot average. If we could do like that, that would be a nicer way to write your program. And for that, to achieve this, student cannot be considered as dictionary, or cannot be considered as something else rather than an object. So to achieve that, we have to we have to write this same programming in object oriented programming way. So now just let me remove this part. And to start with object oriented programming, first of all, what we need to do is, the very first thing, we need to create a class. And how to create a class? We have to use the Python's keyword called class in smaller case, and then we have to write the class name that we want to give. So what should be our class name? Like we want to create an object that will be a student, so we can create the class name as student with S capital and colon. Now, what is a class? So class is a blueprint of your object. That means it is, by doing this class student, we are not creating the object. We are simply defining what would be what our object will look like what will be the behaviors of our object, what will be the properties of our object that our object will have. So it is basically a definition of our object that we will create in further. So when we write class and the class name as student and colon and then enter, you will see that automatically 4 indentation has been given here. Now the next thing that we want to do is to write a method called init method. So how to write it? Def underscore underscore init underscore underscore bracket. Now init method is, it is used to initialize the properties of your object that it will have. So what are the properties that our object student will have? Suppose it can have a name, it can have grades, it can have address, it can have roll numbers. Whatever the properties your object can have will be first initialized inside this init method. Now remember that this init method, I'm calling it method because it is inside a class. So whatever the methods you see that will be present inside a class will be a method, not a function. Okay. So now inside, when I'm creating this init method, I have to pass one parameter called self. Now what is self? Self is basically denoting the object itself. That means whatever the object you will create out of this class student will be denoted by this parameter as self. So that means when I'm passing self and giving colon and enter, I can write it like this: self dot name equals to, within inverted comma, Rolf. So that means whatever the object you will create, that suppose you are going to create a student object, the name of that student object will be Rolf. Okay. So here this self is just simply denoting the object itself. So and you can give any other name, any other parameter name inside this init method, but it is a Python convention that everybody uses self to denote the object itself. So but you can give any other name of your choice, so that doesn't matter. And now if you see, then we have given the name as Rolf of that object, and now we are going to create our object. So we will create a student object like this, student. Notice that this student has a lowercase s and the class student has the uppercase s, right? So how to create the object now? We have to write the object name that we want to give, called student, equals to the class name, that is the uppercase S student, and then open a parenthesis and close a parenthesis. So this line will create a new object of this class student. And you can see that here I have, I have given two brackets over here. So you must be confused that ideally when we use brackets, like to call a function or to call a method, we use brackets, like but in object oriented programming, we use brackets whenever we are going to create a new object with our class name as well. So you have to remember this. Okay, how to create an object? Just write the object name equals and then the class name, then open a parenthesis and close the parenthesis. Now, as we created an object of student class, we can directly access this name property of student object. How? We just simply can do print student dot name. Now, remember, when you are accessing any property of your object, you don't need to give any parentheses. Just simply write the object name, then dot, and then the property name. You don't need to give any parentheses, like here you needed to give a parenthesis when calling the class name. So just saving it and running it. You will see that we have, Rolf as the student's name. So the same thing we can do with the grades of the student, like this: 10, 20, and 30. Now self.grades, that means the whatever the object we will create out of this class student will have the grades as 10, 20, and 30. So again we can do print student dot grades. And now if I run it again, you will see that the name is printed as Rolf and now grades is printed as 10, 20, and 30. So this name and grades that is inside the student class is directly related to this student object because we have created this object out of the student class itself. So as of now, there is nothing more complicated. So now what we want to do is to calculate the average of our students' grades, right? So what you can guess, we will do like this: average, and just define a function called average, and we will pass student dot grades like this. Yes, you are partially right, because we can do this like this way. We can create an average function and then we can pass student grades, as the input of this average function. But we will not do this. Okay, we will actually take the advantage of object-oriented programming and will do the same thing in a slightly different approach. How? Now we are going to actually define one more method called average inside our class, like this. Okay, so again, whenever you are defining any methods inside your class, you have to pass the self parameter here, which will be denoting the your object itself. So as I already told you that you can use any other name, but try to use self only, okay? Because this is a Python convention and it will be much readable when some other person is reading your code. So try to use self. So here, when I am creating this average method and passing self and giving colon, and now what we can do, we can create we can return this self dot grades and sum of the self dot grades divided by length of the self dot grades. Now notice this thing, that the properties that your object will have has been defined in, I mean, has been initialized in this init method, right? And now these properties, whenever you are using these properties inside this class, you have to use it with this self dot attached. That means if you are using in any methods your properties like names or grades or roll numbers or address, you have to type it self dot name, self dot grades, self dot roll number, like this. Okay, just remember it. Now what I have done, that I have created one average method. It is also a method because it is inside the class and returning that sum of self dot grades divided by length of self dot grades. Okay, and here you can see that this average function is also taking self as parameter, but it is not taking any sequence or any number of series or any other inputs as well, right? Because it is just simply taking the object itself inside this average method, and it will calculate the average of the student's grade. Why? Because this average method is directly related to the student object. And how it is related? Here you can see that we have written student, small student, because we are going to create an object of student, equals to capital S student, which is the class. And within this class, this average method is defined. So that's why this average method is directly related to this student object. And now what we can do, we can simply print student dot average and just simply add this parenthesis. Now you must be thinking that we have passed self here when we are creating this average method, but we are not passing anything here, right? Because you know what happens in implicitly Python, what it does internally, it will do like capital S student, which is the student name, sorry, the class name, then the function, the method actually, average, and then within bracket, as it is, passed as self, we have to give the object name, because self is denoting the object itself, student, like this. Okay. So now if I save it and run it, you will see that average has been calculated as 20. So this is what Python internally does, but we will not write like this because this is a much longer way to write it, you know. So we will use the shortcut like this. Just simply we will write our object's name and then dot and then the method, like this. I will show you that it will also, return the same output. See, the same output it is returning. And one more thing that I need to tell you, that whenever you are creating this object out of your class, what it does implicitly, Python will call the init method, and init method will store the properties that you have defined inside the init method into your object. So this init method is called internally by Python whenever you are creating an object out of your class. So here you can see that we have achieved our goal, that we just simply directly related our average method to our student object, and we can return our average grades. This is the key benefit of object oriented programming. You can define methods inside a class that use the object and that was initially created by the init method within them, and so that you don't have to keep track of multiple different pieces of data, and the object itself can contain these methods that you want to use inside it. So all the data and methods are in one place. So that's why we want to use object oriented programming as developers. Now let me tell you that the methods that are inside the class can have any other parameters apart from self. So by telling you this, I want to mention here that there is another approach that you can use while, using OOPS. So here, suppose I'm passing self as the parameter of first parameter of init method, right? Now, what is would be the second approach that we can use, to work with oops? That we are passing a parameter called name here, and we are not going to give Rolf inside the init method. We are not going to hard code the name properties of the student object inside the init method. Rather, what we will do, we will say that self.name, that is the name property of the student object, will be equal to the name which will be passed here. When the object will be created, this name property must be passed here. So what I mean to say is like this: student equals to student, and then we are not going to give anything for self, so nothing for self. Then for name, we are going to pass it like Bob, just changing the name because you can understand. And then we can do the same thing for grades as well. Like we are going to pass the grades here while creating this init method. And here what we will do, that the grades properties of our object will be equal to the grades that will be passed here. That is 10, 50, 30. So as you know that I've already told you that why we are going to pass name and grades here, and name and grades are present in the init method, but we are passing here when we are calling the when we are creating the object from the class name. As I told you before, that when we are creating the object by using the class name like this, student, and open a parenthesis, close a parenthesis, it will internally call the init method. So that's why we are going to pass name and grades here, and nothing is needed to pass for self. And here I need to mention that our grades property is equal to the grades that is passed here. And you can give any other name as your wish, that inside these parameters, inside this init method. But remember to give the same names of these parameters as here. Like if you're going to give name 1, you have to mention name 1 here, and grades 1, you have to mention the grades 1 here, because that's how it will define that the names and grades properties will be equal to the names and grades of grades that is passed inside the init method. So this thing can be done, and if I run it again, you will see that Bob is printed, and the grades are 10, 50, and 30. And now, why we are doing this? Why we are not hard coding the name and grades here and passing it while creating the object? Why? Because we can create multiple objects out of one class by taking this approach. How? Now we can do is student 1 is student Bob 10, 50, 30, and then student 2 equals to student, and then for name we can give say Rolf again, and the grades are 50, 20, 30. And now we can access the property, that is names and grades of student 1 and student 2 separately. How? We can access this like this: student 1 dot name, which will print for student 1's name. Then we can do print student 2 dot name, which will access the student 2's name, and then student 1 grades, then again student 2 grades like this, and then again student 1's average, and then again student 2's average. And just run this, You will see that Bob roll for student 1 and student 2 name, 10, 50, 30 and 50, 20, 30 for student 1 and student 2 grades, and the averages of student 1 and student 2 separately. So this is the benefit of not hard coding your names and grades inside your init method, rather to pass it when you are creating the object by calling the class name. You can create multiple objects out of one class. So this is the advantage of object oriented programming. So that's it for today's session. I hope you have got a good understanding of object-oriented programming after watching this video. So we are going to cover some other features of Python OOPS in the next videos as well. So keep watching. And yes, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. And also, please let me know if there is any doubt or any suggestions you have in the comment section. So see you in next session. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.